Well, hello and welcome everyone. It's 11 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm April Cole, the Director of Alumni Programs here at Rice University, and I'm very excited to see so many of you joining our webinar today, titled Substance or Fluff? Insights from renowned leadership scholar Tom Kolditz. This webinar is hosted by the Association of Rice Alumni in partnership with the Doerr Institute of New Leaders at Rice. Before we jump into our program, let me just share a few housekeeping tips with you. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation, and we definitely welcome your questions. We ask that you place them in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. You can also place them in the chat, and my fellow colleagues, Alexa and Kate, are moderating the chat on the back end, and they'll be gathering them. There will also be a few polls throughout the webinar, so please participate when we come to those. And if you're wondering, will this be recorded? Yes, a recorded version will be available. We'll probably include it in the follow-up email later this week, and it will also be on the Video Vault section of our website. In addition, if you're posting insights from this webinar on social media, we encourage you to do that. We'd love it if you use the hashtag RiceAlumni, and also our official Rice Alumni Twitter account right now is live tweeting this webinar as well. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, there will be a short survey at the end of this webinar, and it will include a couple questions to kind of gauge your thoughts around today's session, and also to hear your suggestions around additional topics or even speakers that you might like to see. So please take a moment and complete the survey when it comes to time. Well, with that said, we are clearly living in a time where effective leadership is needed to deal with the many crises we find ourselves facing as a society. As you know, you can go into a bookstore and find hundreds of books on leadership, and you can browse LinkedIn and Facebook feeds and find articles and opinions up and down. And probably a few of you participated in seminars and conferences addressing the issue of leadership. Maybe you've even hosted some. The question, though, that we need to ask, however, is what actually works? What is it that we can take back to our jobs and our companies and our teams and know that we will see a measurable impact? Well, that's the question that Tom Kolditz is going to seek to help us answer today. Dr. Kolditz is a retired brigadier general and the founding director of the Ann and John Doerr Institute for New Leaders at Rice University, the most comprehensive, evidence-based, university-wide leader development program in the world. Prior to Rice, he taught as a professor and served as the director of the Leadership Development Program at the Yale School of Management. He also led the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point for 12 years. General Kolditz is a highly experienced global leader with more than 35 years in leadership roles on 4 continents. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology as well as sociology from Vanderbilt, 3 master's degrees, and a PhD in psychology from the University of Missouri. I'm thrilled to have him here with us today. He's going to share his wisdom, his expertise, and his insights. So wherever you are, please help me welcome Dr. Kolditz.
Thanks, April. I really appreciate the introduction. And to the folks who have connected with us here today, I'm really honored that you're taking the time to do this and that you think I might have something to say on this topic. I'll do my best not to let you down. I've worked on this particular issue of what works and what doesn't work for more than 25 years. I feel like I've learned a lot. And I've learned a lot about a field that unfortunately has a lot of things sold in it that don't work. And we refer to that in the Doerr Institute as leader-tainment. They're things that seem attractive and they entertain people, but there is no measurable change in their capacity to lead. This is not, a Tom Kolditz thing. One of the reasons I'm able to talk to you about this is that we have really strong measurement people in the Doerr Institute, led ably by Dr. Ryan Brown. And much of the data that you see in this little presentation and some of the things I say are a direct result of Ryan's expertise and work. So let me tell you, I'll share my screen and put up some slides, and let me tell you what we're going to talk about and how. Whoops. There we go. so what I'm going to do is start by talking to you a little bit about the Doerr Institute and what we learned as we pulled it together over the last 4 years or so. And I'm not going to give you many opinions about what's substance and what's fluff. I'm going to tell you what we know. I'm just going to tell you what we have found to be true by applying mostly psychological research principles. We use some sociological research techniques, but mostly our measurement is psychological because we're looking for change in individuals. That's what we're looking for. And then after I talk a little bit about the Doerr Institute, we'll get into the specific topic of, how do people learn to lead? What's the process by that? And what activities help with that? And what activities perhaps don't? And then I'm looking forward to answering any questions you all might have. And that includes anything that I talk about here today. And I also know that you don't always have a retired Army General Officer in front of you, so I'm willing to answer any question that you might have. I'm pretty adept at handling the tough ones, and so don't worry, don't screen them, just ask me whatever you'd like to be asked. Oh, and one of the things that we're going to have during this presentation are a couple polling questions. So, April, could you have your team put up the first poll for us, please? There we go. So you're probably on this call because you think self-development is important. So let us know, how do you develop yourself now? So it's looking like the two most popular ways of developing are, first of all, listening to leadership speakers or podcasts, and then also reading leadership books. Those two things are pretty accessible, pretty enjoyable, and they're very popular. And then people also are in company or organization development programs, a third, which is a good number there. Many are being mentored, and the fewest of all are being professionally coached. So let me see if I can end the polling. And then close it out. Okay. So kind of remember that, kind of remember how people are on our call are developing themselves, and let's get started a little bit. And let me tell you a little bit about where the Doerr Institute has been in the past 4 years or so. And there we go. So we really started with a strategic plan in February of 2016. And we have graduates from 2017, 2018, 2019 on this call, of course. And at the time we started, it was myself and Lily Bezzosi, who's our senior associate director. And we wrote a strategic plan that the John and Ann Doerr and David Lebron approved in February. And till now, we've built the Doerr Institute to where we have more than 100 people working on behalf of Rice students, including 35 to 40 coaches, 10 full-time people. We've got about 45 student affiliates who work for us diligently. We have grad students, we have postdocs, so it's a pretty complex machine right now. We were able to complete our first 5-year strategic plan in about three and a half years. And so we're working on our second strategic plan now. And we started with a leader development vision that had to do with reaching out to Rice students and increasing their capacity to lead. So we did not have a specific research function. We did not have an academic teaching function around leadership. Our job is to help Rice graduate more leaders and better leaders. That's what we do. We have 17 separate programs. A lot of people know about our coaching program, but there are 16 others that are run by Stephanie Taylor and Ruth Reitmeyer and others. And they're open to all Rice students in good standing. And that means graduate students and undergraduate students. We recently reached out to everyone at Rice that our student affiliates identified as a student activist. And we offered them a professional coach, which honestly they were eligible for anyway in most instances. But we've offered them that because we see activism in current circumstances as a highly developmental opportunity for students. And if they'd like to use that opportunity when they're passionate and working hard to get better as leaders, then we're gonna help them. We started out really with no office space, and we were generously given some space by Peter Rodriguez in McNair Hall. We do all of what the Doerr Institute does out of about 1,200 square feet. So it's a highly efficient operation that does not require a lot of physical presence. We're organizers and managers and knowledge workers. We're not, we don't make shoes in there. So we don't necessarily have to physically be there. And we were able to adapt very well to current circumstances of distancing. And we were pretty much 100% online by the 9th of March. So we were a rapid early adopters of that. And we started with a 12-student pilot. And now we have 36% of the undergrads, and a little less actually than 45% of grad students. Grad students are very hard to count because we have different kinds. So we have 6-year grad students that are in PhD programs. We have 2-year grad students that are MBAs, and we have some 1-year grad students that are in professional master's programs. But the big news is they are every bit as enthusiastic, if not more so, than the undergrads that participate in our programs. And that's unusual. Usually at universities that have leader development programs, they're focused almost entirely on undergraduates and the biochemists and the master's students and the cello and people like that are overlooked, but not at Rice. And it's gotten us a lot of recognition. You see there on the right side of the slide, last year we were designated the most outstanding program by the Association of Leadership Educators. And this year, there's a research and ranking agency in London called Global Gurus, and they ranked us as the #4 leader development program globally. And that put us ahead of a lot of really great programs, including a global business school called INSEAD that most people have heard of, and also John Maxwell Teams also competed for that, and they ranked us higher. So we're getting global recognition for what we're doing, and we like that for Rice. Okay, April, I think we have another polling question for people as we transition. So could we bring up that second one? Okay, that's the first one. There we go. So the question is, you're in a working environment where you're being deliberately developed as a leader or future leader. Okay, so about a 40-60 split. And that is almost exactly what the national statistics on this say. It's very common. It ranges anywhere from about 36% that are being developed to in some areas, upwards of 45%, but this is very representative of Rice. And generally speaking, the more senior a person is in an organization, the more likely they are to be developed. 50% of the money that's spent on leader development in companies is spent on the top 2% of the company. And the remaining 50% gets spent on the rest of the company. So this is pretty typical. Okay. So the question is, if you are deliberately developed, that's a good thing. But what if you're not? Like what if you're not being deliberately developed either in school or in your company? Well, these are some data that I want to share with you that Ryan Brown pulled together on 2,300 Rice students. And the green and blue lines that you see there represent graduates and undergraduates who do not do anything at Rice to develop themselves as leaders. So they don't do Doerr, they don't do RCEL, they don't do Center for Civic Leadership. They just work hard, get good grades, go to med school, go to wherever. They concentrate on things other than leader development. And what Ryan did was he used our measures for gauging an increase in a person's capacity to lead, and he applied those measures to those students across their time at Rice. And the reason we did it was we were looking for a curve that we could accelerate, that we could figure out what the up curve is caused by, and then we could accelerate that. And as you can see by those two lines, there is no curve. If you don't work hard, if you don't work deliberately at leader development, when you come to Rice, you will have high school level leadership skills when you graduate. You will be not significantly different. In fact, you can see the grad student line, they actually get a little worse over their 5 or 6 years here. The dotted line shows where Doerr Institute participants wind up on average with their leader identity. And the thing that's really amazing about that is not really represented by the graph. That line, that red line, starts below those green and blue lines. So it's not a matter of self-selection. We're starting with people who are actually slightly below the Rice average, and they finish way, way up there. But the important news here is that if you don't work at it, you don't get better. A 4-year degree does not get you even an incremental increase in your capacity to lead. And that's sometimes a presumption at colleges and universities, because most of them have leadership or leader development in their mission statements or their visions, but they don't do very much. And consequently, we think that a lot of them, in fact, we've measured this in other colleges and universities, and people do believe that getting a 4-year degree helps you be a better leader. We find no evidence of that. So that's one of the first things to know about what works and what doesn't work. April, I think we have one last polling question. So this is about your supervisor. How are they doing? Outstanding among all leaders, struggling? Okay, so about 60% are coming up on the positive side of being able to fulfill their responsibilities as a leader. Some just sufficient, 22%. 31% better than most leaders, which I guess is statistically not borne out, because a higher percentage needs more development, and a full 15% are either struggling or failing, which is too bad. We don't wish that on any leader, and we certainly don't want Rice graduates to be in those circumstances. So now let's transition and talk about how you avoid fluff, how you get there. So the Doerr Institute's founded on 4 fundamental first principles. The first is that leader development is a core function of universities. What that means is Rice accepts their own mission and vision of producing leaders. And they view it as a core function, which means it's available to lots and lots of people at Rice, because the university itself wants to succeed. That's also why the Doerr Institute works for the president and the provost and is not in a small center under a dean or in a department somewhere, because it's a core function. And your organization itself should have a declarative statement about leader development being core to what it does, that it wants to develop its people. Second, we only use evidence-based practices. And that in and of itself doesn't get you very much, because the phrase evidence-based can mean almost anything. And we'll talk about more about that later. But we do use practices that we know have worked other places. And that's how we define evidence-based practices, that we have experience with them working other places. We only use professional leader development staff. So we don't ask professors not of discipline to do this as an additional duty. We don't use external mentors. We don't use anyone except people who consider leader development their primary occupation. In other words, they get paid for doing it. So professional coaches, professional facilitators, people who do that kind of work deliberately. And then lastly, and this is maybe the most important, we measure outcomes objectively, not just process. And that is one of your first clues when someone approaches you about leader development, about whether it's fluff or substance. So let's look at that. So here are examples of both process measures and outcome measures. And so on the left, you see 2 process measures. 2,600 students have attended. 98% would recommend coaching to a peer. Those are process measures. And if you look at those with a little bit of critical thinking, is it possible that both those things could be true and no one actually learned how to lead? Yes, that's possible. It's possible because you're not measuring a leadership variable. You're measuring the process by which you delivered it. So when someone comes to you with evidence that their program or what they're offering is working, look and see if it's a process measure or if it's an outcome measure. So you see under outcome measures, 2.8 as many Doerr Institute students measured as strong leader identity as non-Doerr Institute students after controlling for self-selection. That is also true, but it's an outcome. Leader identity affects whether people choose to lead, how well they lead, whether they step into leadership roles, and so forth. And then 95 to 120 fewer Rice students seek counseling, and it's causally linked to their being coached, which means we're also controlling other variables. And that is also a true statement. Now, we don't coach people because we don't want them to seek counseling. But what we find is participation impacts things like psychological distress, sense of purpose, sense of well-being, and so forth. And so we're able to then match that to the students who seek psychological counseling, and we find that we're producing a significant decrease in that. So those are outcome measures, and those are the kind of things that you should look at when people are trying to sell you leader development products or processes. Now, we've looked at a lot of things in the Doerr Institute to deliver the leader development effects that we need. And some of the more common ones you see on the left-hand side there, and you see all of the things that were common in our first survey on how people are developing themselves. So leadership seminars, academic classes, leadership speakers, single session workshops, mere experience. The data that we have suggests that those things on the left do not contribute to the advancement of a student's capacity to lead. So you will not see the Doerr Institute bringing in leadership speakers. Why not? Because, well, first of all, students don't really like to go to them. I mean, they'll be lightly attended. But even if we brought in a leadership rock star, you know, members of our board, Colin Powell or you know, someone famous, people leave speaker sessions about the same as when they went in. Same thing with single session workshops. Single session workshops, we don't find are impactful enough on students' lives that there's any kind of permanent change in them that we can measure. Academic classes and leadership seminars are terrific for knowledge transfer. So if you want to teach someone how leadership works, those two things work great. But you can go through an entire semester of leadership classes and never have the kind of application that results in your actually being a better leader. And mere experience. You know, people talk a lot about getting experience, but compared to experience that has guided reflection, mere experience doesn't really do that much. I mean, you've heard the term, you know, practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. When you think of all the bad leader habits and those 30% of leaders that are struggling or failing, most of those habits were learned over time. They just learned bad habits, because bad habits can sometimes get you ahead in a corporate environment, and consequently, people pick those up. But the things on the right, professional coaching, we find works powerfully, and we measured, you know, more than a dozen psychological variables looking for change in people. Professional coaches change people. Interestingly, mentors do not. Mentors are very useful for career development, and we love the Sally Portal, and we like the mentors that are used in places like Arcel and elsewhere, because there's a big career development component that the Doerr Institute does not get involved in. So we don't do career development. It's too broad. You know, we're working with cellists and biochemists and MBAs. So we leave that to other people. And professional coaches are the best at advancing leader capacity. We also find multi-session workshops that we call catalyst modules to be successful. So what happens in that workshop is that students take in some knowledge and they reflect on their experience, and then they have some goals and they practice some things for about 2 weeks. And then they come back to another workshop where it's all reviewed, and then they go out for another 2 weeks and practice and work on it. And it's that 4-week segment of practice and application that's causing the change that we measure even 90 days later. So those things work pretty well. Group topical coaching, when people come together and they've all got the same problem and they're coached by a professional, that works. Also, reflective processes. So whether it's reflective journaling or reflective peer groups that meet, anything that causes you to intelligently process the experience that you've gotten is likely to cause an increase in your future capacity to lead. What's usually missing from experience is the reflection piece. And so if you can create that, and then also, and this may surprise some people, but there's pretty good evidence that if you're doing these other things, the mere passage of time will make you better. And that has to do with these ideas blending and supporting one another. You know, if you develop yourself along 2 leadership competencies, let's say communicating and decision-making, and you get better at both of those, over time, your ability to communicate better is going to also impact your decision-making. And likewise, the fact that you're making more and better decisions is going to impact how you communicate that. And the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. That's how the passage of time works. And when you think that Korn Ferry has isolated 175 statistically independent leadership competencies, when all those start working together, the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts pretty quickly. And that's why working at it works so well, and why not working at it gets you pretty much nowhere. So what, bringing this all together, what's this telling us about leader development? Well, first of all, it's saying the more professional it is, the more likely it is to work. And secondly, it's not the singular leadership events that, whether it's a coaching session, a multi-session workshop, or anything else, it's not the events. It's the work that happens between the events that's causing that change in people's abilities. And Rice students, we find, are energetic hard workers. And so the time between their coaching sessions, they make good use of it. And that's where they're developing. So the coaches are not magicians that change people's lives in a single session. They're setting off this longer term experience reflection, and all the practice that happens in between that. And it's powerful. And I found that everywhere I've worked for the last 25 years. At West Point, we had a program where every year we would take 25 Army captains, and in conjunction with Columbia Teachers College, my department would give all 25 of them a 36-hour credit hour master's degree in org psych and leader development. And then they would go and work for 3 years in the Corps of Cadets. So that would be the equivalent of having 8 Ivy League trained leader developers in every residential college at Rice, permanent, full-time. And consequently, that would set up these processes of coaching and teaching, in this case, cadets, how to lead over the 4 years that they're at West Point. It's very powerful. So when I went to Yale to build this program in their business school, I said, what we have to have are professional people who can work with our MBA students over the course of the 2 years that they're here, not just give them a workshop or give them a speaker series or something like that. And that's when I started to use professional ICF coaches. And then I made plenty of mistakes at Yale. We didn't make any of those at Rice. So we improved as we went, and we figured out how to make that process work at Rice. And that's why we're getting the effects that we're getting. It's not just because we have certain events. It's because of what people do between multiple events, whether it's multiple coaching sessions, multiple workshops. That works. It flat works every time. And our success rates among students that are doing this in terms of measuring significant increases in their ability to lead are whopping. I mean, I'm a social psychologist by training, so is Ryan. They're huge effects. They're not just statistically significant. They're big enough to have practical significance. And we're in the midst of an ROI study right now so that we can tell Rice what kind of impact this means. Because, with upwards of 40% of the student body participating, impacts are important. So we're finding, for example, that that in their first job, they make about $10,000 more than their peers. And that's after controlling for things like type of degree and self-selection and so forth. Now, that's not why we train Rice students as leaders. It's not, but it happens. And it's an important return on investment at the university level. We also, and DAR will love this, but we also find that our graduates who work with Doerr tend to donate more back to the university. And we believe it's because they have a level of appreciation that's slightly more acute than students who have not participated in activities where the university really tried to make them whole. You know, we do a lot to educate students and we do a lot to develop them. But when you go through a process of coaching or some of these other processes, you really feel the focus of the university on you. You know, that there's an earnest attempt to make you significantly better, and we think that that pays off. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is some of the things that make me suspicious when I hear people say them, and they should, I believe, make you suspicious too. The first is, this worked for Google or Facebook or, you know, some other company. Of course, that's the logical fallacy of you know, assuming that something works one place works in another. And it's usually used in the absence of other kinds of evidence. And that's the part that should really make you suspicious. Sometimes you hear, oh, well, you won't see the effects of this for years. I was on a call this morning with something called the League of Leadership. It's people running leadership centers in all the top 20 business schools. And they let me in. I don't know why, but they let me in. And, you know, one of them was talking about this. Well, you know, we don't know how to measure this, but we think our effects are going to be seen years from now. Really? Well, why wouldn't you expect them to be seen now and years from now? That's what we're looking for at Rice. We want to measure them now, and then we want to measure them and see that they've stayed robust. This is based on scholarly research. And when somebody says something like that, I always think of what I refer to as the Souffle Principle. So the fact that a souffle rises, that's based on science. That's based on a recipe and cooking techniques. So if you do it right, it's going to rise. And so we believe in that science. But if I give that recipe for a souffle to my 6-year-old grandson, and I say, hey, William, make a souffle, I'm betting better than even money that souffle is not going to rise. You know, he is not going to get souffle effects. And he can probably try over and over again, and it's going to be a long time until he gets a souffle to work, even though it's based on a solid piece of research and solid principles. So we are far more focused on outcome measurement than whether or not it fits some theory up front. I mean, it can follow a theory, it can be in accordance with principles, but just because it should work doesn't mean it does work. And we measure what does work. This works for everyone from execs to line employees. No, people differ in their needs. And this is all about meeting these people where they're at. So some of the things that we do for students at Rice, you know, may not work for senior executives. And our coaches know that. Our coaches work with both of them, both kind of groups. And anytime somebody tells you that a presentation was life-changing for them, it just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. That's what I can tell you that I've discovered over 25 years of doing this, that we've seen happen in exactly the same way at Rice as it happened conceptually at Yale, as it happened conceptually at West Point. It's not about some of these one-shot deals. It's about hard work with professionals using proven techniques. And the big growth comes between the events. It doesn't come in the events, certainly not in a single event, like a speaker or a single session workshop or something like that. And, you know, you can imagine that reading a book, even if it's a really good book, is not going to work unless you go apply it. So the best presentations in exec ed that I've seen, and I've been working for some universities exec ed for more than 20 years, they are very prescriptive about giving a deliberate technique and then saying, go practice this. And, you know, when I'm finished with some of these exec ed sessions, for the next 6 months, I get emails back from people. Hey, I tried this and it worked well. I tried this and it's not working for me. That creates change in people. But it wasn't my presentation. It was their application of it and reflection around it that made them a better leader. Now, I wish, I've been with the Speakers Bureau since 2007. I wish that leadership speakers change people. I wish that leadership books change people. I wish that TED Talks change people. But we just don't find any evidence for that. They're very entertaining. They're very popular. I get emails, I'm around a lot of these people that get referred to as thought leaders. I get an email from one of about 5 different thought leaders almost every day or at least every week. I delete every single one of them. I don't read any of them because I know they're not going to do anything for me. I know they're not going to change me. So with that, that's kind of it. It's pretty darn simple. You want to make a souffle? You cook it with a professional cook. They coach you at it. Then you practice it during the week, and some of them fall and some of them don't fall. Then you try it again with the professional cook. And you do that 5 times, you will be a souffle ace. And it's the same thing with leader development. It's just the same thing. So with that, I'm open to any kind of questions that April and her cohorts may be collecting on Q&A or chat or wherever it is. I've really enjoyed talking to you all about this. What you just experienced is like a typical daily discussion internal to the Doerr Institute. We talk about this stuff all the time, about how we could do better, how we can make something work. But then there's Ryan Brown, Rice graduate, PhD from the University of Texas, and he says, sorry, that doesn't work. So we move on to something else.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was very insightful. We have a number of questions. We're going to do our best to get through as many as we can with being mindful of time. Let me start with this one here for you. During my corporate career, the biggest knock I heard against various company cultures was that they were too political. Also, clearly today, our political leaders are straitjacketed by extreme partisanship. In both cases, how does one display true leadership without committing political suicide?
Yeah, so the research on this is pretty clear. And to me, the best research that's come out on it came out in 2013 in the Academy of Management journals. And it has to do with voice. And when you have a boss that you have to lead up and you're dealing with sensitive political issues and so forth, the first thing you have to be aware of is that when leaders sense disarray in their organizations, and when they begin to be concerned about losing control, they become paranoid. They become very focused on loyalty. They're very concerned that somebody may be undercutting them. And so when you go to them, your first concern has to be demonstrating loyalty, which you do through a supportive voice. You have to sound like a person whose life's purpose is to support that leader. You're not undercutting, you're not criticizing, you're trying to keep them out of trouble, you're trying to help them manage what they have to manage. Because if you begin discussing with them in a critical or a challenging voice, which is often the case, frankly, with people who've had long-term academic backgrounds, you are instantly on the outside looking in. You'll be ostracized. Your ideas will be rated as less insightful, less practical, and your future will be in question because they'll be concerned about your loyalty. But if you can do it with the kind of supporting orientation, hey, boss, I'm trying to keep you out of trouble, and I think I know how. Let me help you here. Then you can navigate those kinds of political challenges. But a leader who is afraid that they're not doing very well is a dangerous person, because for them, it's all about loyalty and they're suspicious of everyone. And so you have to make yourself on the inside working with them to help them as opposed on the outside looking in.
Another question here that was upvoted. Does your program address racism and other social justice issues?
So we we primarily address the issues that students want addressed. So unlike most people in a university who see students as people to be given certain things to knowledge or what we think is important, we treat our students like clients, and our coaches say, what do you think is important? What's important to you as a leader? Now, we've taken great lengths. We've gone to great lengths, starting in 2016, when the Black Women's Lives Matter movement hit Rice and so forth. We have always offered additional coaching or more coaching to student activists and other people who are trying to enact change. We also have a continuous focus on diversity in our entire staff. So we can coach in Mandarin, we can coach in Spanish. We have African-American coaches, Black coaches that we can offer to students who have that kind of preference. We are an incredibly diverse organization. And if you look at a photo of the Doerr Institute itself, it's also very diverse. So we have these multiple perspectives that we can bring in. We started to have a special focus on diversity in 2016 at the request of the provost. And I believe the way we worked it was each student that was coached had to select a population that they were unfamiliar with. Maybe a church that they didn't know anything about, Sikhs, for example, or some other population. And as part of the coaching, they had to learn about that population, come to understand them, and process that with their coaches. Well, when we looked at whether or not it was making a difference, it bombed. So we stopped doing that particular thing. And we attributed that to the fact that it was the only thing that we were doing to students. We were requiring this of students when they had not asked for it, and they were not necessarily interested in doing it. And that's just a thing that we found about development, that if you're trying to force something down students' throats, it's not going to work. I briefed the Academic Affairs Committee of the Board of Trustees, and one of the questions was, well, if this is great for 40% of students, why don't we do it for all of them? And the fact is, self-selection is our friend. People who think they can develop. And people who have no interest in it are not going to develop. It's kind of like, I told them, it's kind of like intramural sports. You could build the argument that exercise and intramural sports is good for everyone. But if you required it at Rice, there'd be a bunch of students sitting on the bench, looking at their phones, eating snacks, just kind of going through the motions. And that's what would happen if we made our development process as a requirement instead of an opportunity. And I think it's that way around matters of race. So we're very sensitive to it, but we give students what they want rather than telling students what they need.
There's two questions that address nonprofit work, so I want to combine those. The first is, what is the recommendation for nonprofit companies in developing leadership without the funds to hire professional coaches? And the second is, have you studied leadership in the nonprofit sector where maybe money would not be the primary measure of success?
Yes, I have. In fact, one of my early mentors was a woman named Frances Hesselbein, who was CEO of the Girl Scouts of America in the 70s. She's the one who brought in Bill Blass to redo their uniforms. And she's a tremendous leader in the nonprofit space. I also just recently had a conversation, and I'm personally coaching one of our graduates at Rice, a young man named Tim Harrison, who has a nonprofit where he wants underserved people to be coached. He feels like if we can direct coaching to them, that they'll be able to advance better and they'll be more successful entrepreneurs in the nonprofit space or in business, but they're underserved people. So he and I have discussed various models for doing that. One model is the same model as Tom's Shoes, where you organize coaches and they coach executives for a given fee. And the nonprofit helps find those executive clients. But then if they're given an executive client who they're coaching for a large fee, they have to coach two people who pro bono who are in nonprofits, something like that. So you have to make it in the best interest of coaches to do that kind of nonprofit work. And one way to do it is that Tom's model. The other model, and we do pay our coaches in the Doerr Institute, but we kind of pay them less than anybody else. And the way that we do that is we do not hire them full-time as internal coaches. We only pay them for the work they do for us, which means they're open to have as many executive clients in other companies as they want. And then we offer them a lower rate, but much higher volume. We have coaches that'll coach 40 students in a year, and they'll be lucky to coach 4 executive clients a year, or maybe 6. And so we create the conditions for them to have a base of income with hard work, but also the opportunity to earn more. And that allows us to coach at a rate that makes our programming, including the coaching, half as expensive as classroom instruction at Rice. Half. And so if you're in a nonprofit and you want your people to be coached, don't give up. There are a lot of ways to create the conditions for coaches to work at low cost or no cost, because there are other segments of the coaching industry where people are paying $750 an hour to be coached. And so when you're up against something like that, there are ways of leveraging that privilege to be supportive in a nonprofit space. And I'm very enthusiastic about that. If anybody ever wants to call me on the phone or email me and talk about how to generate opportunities in the nonprofit space, I'm there.
Wonderful. Here's a question. I've requested individual coaching for 2 members of my team to improve behavioral issues so they can move back into management roles. How can I measure the improvement?
Yeah, so couple basic principles that we've learned, and they can be applied elsewhere. So the first, in my view, the most telling evidence that you've changed a person's capacity to lead comes from the people who are being led, not the person who's leading. So after they've been coached, even before, you need to ask the people around them who they are impacting what their level of ability is. And then after they've been coached, go back to those same people. So don't worry so much about the leader themselves. Hell, everybody thinks they're a great leader, but ask the people that are around them. And then secondly, the other thing that really betrays that leader development is working, people's leader identity changes. And we do measure that. We have a scale that's been validated that we use to measure that as a psychological variable. But we also know that people who have an increased leader identity tend to step up and take leadership opportunities and leader roles. So if you see that behavior in those individuals, where they're beginning to step up and step into various leader roles, it probably worked. And if you don't see any change in that behavior with them, they're probably the same person that started. And it's really important in the example that you gave, because it sounded almost like the circumstances were remedial. When somebody is a high performer and they want to get better and they want to be coached, that works pretty well. But when somebody's struggling and their company gives them a coach because their company wants to be able to show that they tried, a lot of times that doesn't work quite as well, because Those people are not self-selected. We'll go back to what we see in the Rice student body. The students who come to Doerr are not the typical already high-performing leaders. They're people who want to get better, and those people get better. But people who think they're already good, or people who just don't want to do it, they're not going to get better just because they went to coaching sessions. So it's about behavioral change, and that's always seen by the people around them, and you can see it yourself if they look for other leader roles.
There's so many questions, Tom. Let's go to this one. Can you talk a little bit more about how leader identity is calculated?
Yes. So if you're a social psychologist, one of the things that you've done is you've studied the formation of a person's identity, who they are, and in particular, self-identity. Who do they think they are? And so if you measure identity, but you qualify it with specifics about being a leader, you can come up with a number of questions based on known identity scales that you can then validate by giving them to people who you already know have a strong leader identity and people who you know have no leader identity at all. They don't think of themselves as leaders at all. And so we were able to scientifically build our own scale that measures the extent to which people see themselves as leaders and believe that they can lead and are comfortable with that and want to. And it's really, in terms of social psych, it's pretty nuts and bolts. It's not that hard to do if you're a trained professional. So it's hard for people who are, they're engineers or whatever, to come up with these kinds of measurements. But for Ryan Brown, he can do it standing on his head. And so that's how we created the leader identity scale. That's how it's measured by professional psychologists. And it's just a variation of something that psychologists have measured for 50 years, which is individual identity and how that affects behavior. And so we've just taken a special case of it. And now we've been able to connect it with all kinds of subsequent behaviors. So we don't think it works. We know it works because we see these behaviors exhibited by students after their leader identity has been elevated. And the way that we control for self-selection is also a classic psychological research method. It's basically a time series design. So we ask people, who wants to be developed as leaders? And we get this big pool of self-selected participants. And then we wait list half of them. And we give half of them our treatment, and we measure all of them. So we're only measuring out of a population that is already self-selected into our process. And that's how we know it's what we're doing, and not just, the people who want to be leaders would all experience growth. No, we know better than that. That would be a rookie error.
We're going to take two more. Recognizing in the business world and military that leaders are generally looking to do the right thing and follow directives from the C-suite, how can the average leader get the wider rank and file leaders to take general interest actions faster?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. Could you repeat it?
Sure. Recognizing in the business world and military, leaders are generally looking to do the right thing, follow directives from the C-suite. How can the average leader get the wider rank and file leaders to take general interest actions faster?
Yeah. So that's a question both about motivation and direction. So how can we motivate and get energy in there and then make sure they head in the right direction? And I usually teach a technique called intent statements, leader intent. usually when people are not willing to kick off with that kind of initiative, it's because they don't know one of four things. They haven't been explained the purpose for what they need to be doing. They haven't been told any specific mandatory tasks. They don't know what the end state is supposed to look like. And maybe one of the most powerful, they don't know how much risk they can take on their own. How much risk is the C-suite going to underwrite before punishing them? Or put it another way, what does the C-suite not want to happen? If they know those four things, they're very likely to take initiative because they're not worried about what's going to happen. They know what the boss is going to underwrite. They know when they're safe. It's in that box, in that intent. But if they don't know what the end state's supposed to look like, or if they're afraid that if anything goes wrong, they're going to be blamed, they're not going to do anything. They'll only follow a plan or a task list. They'll say, what do you want me to do now? And when people are acting that way, it's because of their leadership. And I beat executive leaders up about this all the time. I said, you don't have people who take any less initiative than any other people in the world. They take initiative because you're clear and you give them permission to. You tell them what the box looks like. And if they're uncertain, they're just going to follow the plan. They're just going to wait for guidance. And so leaders can have a lot to do with whether people do that or not, whether they move forward or not. But you have to communicate to people in intent, not in a specific plan. Plans become obsolete really quickly. They run off track. They lose their resources. But an intent never changes. And so that's the way that leaders have to communicate with people who are below them, who they want to take independent initiative. And the way you know you've won is when they do something really great that they didn't tell you they were doing, and they come back and they say, well, I didn't have time to talk to you, but I knew it was within your intent. When you hear those words, you're leading at that point. They're thinking like you. And that's what leaders have a hard time getting across to some people. Think like them, and then go.
Before we close, there's a number of questions asking about ways that alumni could be involved with Doerr, receive coaching, resources. We'll be sure to put information in the follow-up emails, but I also just want to give you an opportunity, Dr. Kolditz, if you wanted to speak to that real quickly, anything you'd like to share about involvement, resources, ways to connect, ways to get trained. I want to make sure you have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, well, so first and foremost, the Doerr Institute needs to say thank you to Rice alumni, because we have felt nothing but support from Rice alumni from 2015 until now. We've gotten tremendous support. They've helped us get visibility. They've encouraged us. We are now measuring our outcomes in the alumni space. So we are focused on people who have gone through Doerr Institute programs in the alumni space. That will eventually develop into us being able to offer certain things to alumni. Probably alumni who have already gone through our programming will be the people that we concentrate on first. But we would like to be more helpful. The other way that I think alumni can be useful to us is tell us what you think. We're really approachable. We don't think we've figured this whole thing out yet. We know we haven't. And we constantly self-criticize and try to figure out how to make what we do a little bit better. And, alumni went to Rice. They know Rice. They know how to get under the skin of Rice students. And so, trust us when we say, anytime an alumni calls, they are first among equals in terms of people that we listen to. And we are very grateful for any input you have. Many of you are in business. Many of you are in nonprofits. Many of you are in the arts. And we may not be doing as good a job in some areas as we are in others. And so we will never be afraid of critical feedback. We welcome it. And please help us, because many of you hire Rice graduates now. And so you're going to be seeing our product move through this space. And we're grateful for anything that you can add.
Wonderful. Well, we have come past the end of our session. I know there's still a number of good questions. I want to let you know that my team and I are going to be taking a look at those, and we'll connect with Doerr, and perhaps we'll do a part 2 here. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Kolditz, just for your wisdom and your insight. We really, really appreciate it. I want to thank all of the participants today for coming on out, taking time to be with us. I encourage you to visit alumni.rice.edu to learn more about our virtual programs. We have another webinar coming up on June 24th, in which we'll be discussing how today's crisis can transform K-12 and higher ed. We also recently launched a new podcast called Beyond the Hedges, so you can check that out as well. Again, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time, and please do not forget to complete the survey. We hope to see you again. Thank you.